الاقتصاد في الاعتقاد. Fourth, this is the second treatise. The fourth attribute is will. We claim that God, exalted as He, is a willer of His acts. The proof of this is that an act produced by Him is subject to various possibilities, none of which can be distinguished from others without something given preponderance to one of them. His essence is not sufficient to give preponderance, since its relation to each of two opposites is the same. What is it then that specifies one of two opposites to become actual in certain states and not in others? In the same way, power is not sufficient, for its relation to each of the two opposites is the same. Similar, knowledge is not sufficient, contrary to Al-Ka'bi, who deemed knowledge to be sufficient on its own without will. For knowledge depends on what is known, attaches to it as is, and does not affect it or change it. Thus, if a thing is possible in itself and is equivalent to another possible thing that corresponds to it, then knowledge attaches to it as is. We thus do not assume that one of these two possible things is preponderant over the other. Rather, we conceive of both of them as possible and as equivalent. God, exalted as He, knows that the existence of the world at the time it was brought into existence is possible, and that its existence before or after that time is equivalent to it in possibility. For all these possibilities are equivalent. Hence, knowledge ought to attach to them as they are. If the attribute of will decrees that the world should come into existence at a specific time, knowledge would attach to the specification, namely that it should exist at that time, because the will attaches to the specification. So the will is the cause of the specification, and knowledge attaches to the specification, is dependent on it, and does not affect it. If it were possible for knowledge to be sufficient on its own, without the need for will, it would be sufficient on its own without the need for power. In fact, knowledge would be sufficient for our acts, so that we would not need will, for one of the two possibilities would become preponderant through the attachment of God's knowledge to it, and that is absurd. It might be said, this turns against you regarding the will itself. Just as the eternal power does not relate to only one of two opposites, the eternal will is not specific to only one of two opposites. Its specification of one of two requires a determinate, and this would regress ad infinitum. It is said that the essence is not sufficient for the occurrence of the world. For if it were to occur by virtue of the essence, it would have to coexist with the essence without any delay. Thus there must be power, but power is not sufficient either. For if it were, then why is it this specific time, when any time before it or after is equally suitable for the possibility of the powers being attached to it? What is it that determines this time? Hence it needs will. Now it would be said that will is not sufficient, for the eternal will is universal and in its attachment, just as the eternal power is. Its relation to all the times is the same, and its relation to each of two opposites is also the same. For instance, if motion comes into existence instead of rest, then that is because the will attaches to motion, not to rest. It would be asked, was it possible for the will to attach to rest? If it is said no, then this is absurd, and if it is said yes, then they are equivalent. I mean motion and rest in their relation to the eternal will. What was it, then, that made it necessary for the eternal will to specify motion rather than rest? Hence a determinate is needed. The same question would entail a determinate for the determinate, and this would regress ad infinitum. We say this question has perplexed the minds of all the sects. None was successfully guided to the truth except the followers of the Sunnah. Regarding this question, people are divided into four groups. The first group says that the world is brought into existence through the essence of God, exalted is He, and that there's no attribute that is additional to the essence at all, Since the essence is eternal, the world is eternal, and the relation of the world to the divine essence is as the relation of an effect to its cause, as the relation of light to the sun, and as the relation of a shadow to a person. Those are the philosophers. The second group says that the world is an occurrent. It occurred at the time at which it occurred, and neither before nor after through an occurrent will, which occurred not in any receptacle and which necessitated the occurrence of the world. Those are the Mutazilites. The third group says that the world occurred through an occurrent will that occurred in God's essence. Those are the ones who assert that God is a receptacle of occurrence. The fourth group says that the world occurred at the time which the eternal will attached to its occurrence, without the occurrence of the will itself and without any change in the state of the eternal. So examine these groups and compare the position of each group to the others. No group's position is free from a difficulty that cannot be resolved, except the difficulty of the followers of the Sunnah, for it is easily resolved. Regarding the philosophers, they affirm the anterior eternity of the world. This is absurd, for it is impossible for an act to be interiorly eternal. It's impossible for an act to be anteriorly eternal. The meaning of its being an act is that it was not, and then it is. Thus, if the world has coexisted with God since eternity, how could it be an act? In fact, from this it necessarily follows that there are infinitely many celestial revolutions, as previously discussed, and this is impossible on several grounds. Furthermore, in spite of their plunging into this difficulty, they did not escape the spirit of the question, which is, why did the will attach to the occurrence of the world at a specific time, and neither before nor after, although all times are equivalent in their relation to the will, even if they manage to avoid the specification of time, and they do not manage to avoid the specification of qualities. The world is specified with a particular magnitude and a particular orientation. Their contraries are possible according to reason. The eternal essence does not relate to some possible things to the exclusion of others. There are two grave consequences to their position, for which there is no resolution. We mentioned these in our book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and they have no escape from them at all. One of them is that some of the celestial movements are westward, that is, from the east to the west, and some are eastward, that is, from the west to the east. The opposite of that is equivalent to it in possibility, since the directions are equivalent for motions. How then is it necessitated by the eternal essence, or by the essences of the angels, which are also eternal according to them, that a certain direction is determined instead of an opposite direction, that is equivalent to it in all respects? There is no response to this question. The second is that the outmost celestial sphere, which is the ninth celestial sphere, and which according to them is the mover that coerces all the heavens to move once during a day and night, rotates on two poles, northern and southern. A pole is nothing but one of 2 points that are opposite to each other on the surface of the sphere, and they remain stationary when the sphere rotates, and the equator is a great circle in the middle of the sphere that is equidistant from the 2 poles. We say that the body of the outermost sphere is symmetric and uniform, and every point on it could be imagined to serve as a pole. So what is that which necessitates the specification of 2 points among, according to them, infinitely many points? This must be an attribute that is additional to the essence, and whose function is to specify a thing among its counterparts. This attribute is nothing but the will. We gave a complete analysis of these two consequences in the book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The Mutazilites, on the other hand, also plunge into two repugnant errors. One of them is that the Creator, exalted as He, is a willer through an occurrent will that is not in any receptacle. If the will does not subsist in God, then saying that He has this will is an incoherent statement. It is similar to saying that He is a willer through a will. It is similar to saying that He is a willer through a will that subsists in something other than Himself. The second concerns why the will occurred at this specific time. If this is because of another will, the question is necessarily asked about the second will, and this would regress ad infinitum. If this is not because of another will, then let the world occur at this specific time without a will. An occurrence requires a will because of its being possible, not because of its being a body, heaven. An occurrence requires a will not because of its being possible, not because of its being a body, heaven, a will, or a cognition. And all occurrences are equivalent in this regard. Moreover, they do not escape the difficulty, since it would be said to them, why did the will occur at this specific time? And why was what occurred the will to move, instead of the will to stay still? For according to them, for every occurrence there is a will that occurs and attaches to that occurrence. So why did not the will that attaches to its opposite occur? As for those who opt for affirming the occurrence of the will in God's essence, they manage to eliminate one of the two difficulties, which is that he is a willer through a will that is not in his essence. However, they introduce a new difficulty, which is that God would be a receptacle of occurrence, and this would necessitate his occurrence. Moreover, there remains against them the other difficulty, and hence they do not escape the question. The followers of the truth, on the other hand, say that the occurrence occur through an eternal will that attaches to them and hence distinguishes them from their opposites that are equivalent to them. One's question, why does the will attach to this occurrence when its opposite is equivalent to it in possibility, is the wrong question, since the will is nothing but an attribute whose function is to distinguish one thing among its counterparts. The question, why does the will distinguish a thing from its counterparts, is similar to the question, why does knowledge necessarily reveal its object? It would be said the only meaning of knowledge is that it is what necessarily reveals its object. One's question, why does it necessarily reveal its object, is similar to his question, why is knowledge knowledge? And why is the possible possible? And why is the necessary necessary? This is absurd because knowledge is knowledge by virtue of its essence, and so are the possible, the necessary, and the rest of the essences. The same is true of the will. Its true nature is to distinguish a thing from its counterparts. Someone's question, why does it distinguish a thing from its counterparts, is similar to his question, why is the will and the power? This is absurd. Every group needs to affirm the existence of an attribute whose function is to distinguish a thing from its counterparts. This attribute is nothing but the will. Thus the group with the most plausible position and the most correct path is the one that affirms this attribute and does not render it occurrent. Rather, it asserts that it is eternal and attaches to the occurrence at specific times. Hence, because of this, an occurrence takes place at that specific time. No group can dispense with positing such an attribute, and with it the regress necessitated by this question terminates. Now, given this exposition of the basis of the divine will, you ought to know that, according to us, it attaches to all the occurrence. It has become apparent that every occurrence is originated by God's power, and whatever that power originates requires a will to direct the power to the object and to assign it to it. Hence, every object of power is willed, and every occurrence is an object of power. Therefore, every occurrence is willed. Evil, unbelief, and sin are all occurrences. Therefore, they are inevitably willed by God. Whatever God wills is, and whatever he does not will is not. This is the doctrine of the righteous early Muslims and the universal belief of the followers of the Sunnah, a belief for which demonstrations are given. As for the Mu'tazilites, they say that all of the sins and all of the evil deeds are committed against God's will. In fact, he is adverse to them. It is known that most of what takes place in this world is sin. Therefore, that to which he is averse is more than what he wills. So according to their claim, he is closer to impotence and deficiency. May the Lord of the world be exalted over what the unjust men say. It might be asked, how can he command that which he does not will? And how can he will something that he forbids? And how can he will dissoluteness, sins, injustice, and what is bad? And the one who wills what is bad is obscene. We say if we uncover the true nature of the matter and explain that it is contrary to the divine will, and if we uncover the natures of the notions of bad and good and explain that they are based on being in accordance with or being contrary to one's needs, and God is too exalted to have needs, then all the difficulties are eliminated, God willing. And we will discuss this at the appropriate place.